From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Betsy Peterson. I'm the director of the American Folklife Center, and I want to welcome you all here today to the Library of Congress and to the first day of the American Folklife Center Symposium, Cultural Heritage Archives, focusing on networks, collaboration, and innovation. I also want to especially welcome friends who have come from overseas, and traveled from other countries to be with us today. We're thrilled to have you here, and we hope you will have the time while you're here, even though I know we've booked everything very tightly, but to look at all the other treasures in the library and to drop by the American Folklife Center. As the topic of the symposium today indicates, the focus is really shifting to how we do our work and how we work with each other and how we engage with the public in a much more concerted and active way. I know all of us may be focused on the past and on heritage issues in the work that we do, but our futures depend on how we network together, how we learn to collaborate in a much smarter way that begins to capitalize on all of our strengths, and how we engage a public and bring them into the work that we do. None of us can do this alone, and in that spirit, I know putting on a symposium also you cannot do alone, and the American Folklife Center has worked hard to put this together, but we have also worked with many partners to put this together, and I do want to thank them briefly here. I want to express our gratitude to the American Folklore Society, longtime partners of the center, and particularly to the American Folklore Society Consultancy and Professional Development Program, and to the U.S. Embassy of the Kyrgyz Republic, and I sure hope I said that right. My apologies if I didn't. Both of these programs and agencies provided travel stipends for individuals to get here, and we appreciate that. I also want to thank the American Folklore Society Archives and Libraries section and Hollinger Metal Edge Incorporated for their generous support of the reception later this afternoon. And then thanks, of course, to all the library staff, both within the center and in other divisions, who were very helpful to us and who will be participating in the conference throughout the next 2 days. So I look forward to hearing from all of you. I see some familiar faces, but many new ones, and I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation in the hallways and in between sessions, as well as the sessions themselves. I also want to say, if you have any questions at all, American Folklife Center staff have our little pink badges on, so please accost us, talk to us. We'll do what we can to help you out and answer anything that you need answering to. And we'll be making housekeeping announcements throughout the day about various things. But in the meantime, before we begin, I do want to introduce the Associate Librarian for Library Services, Roberta Schaefer, who would like to say a few words. So again, welcome.
Good morning. It's just such a pleasure to look out on your faces, knowing how much preparation has gone into making this day come true. And so I'm delighted you're here, and I know that we'll all learn a lot from each other in the course of the next several days. So thank you for coming here. It's really a pleasure to be interacting with you. As many of you know, our American Folklife Center was created by an act of Congress and placed in the Library of Congress in 1976. And that was the bicentennial of the United States. And I think that that was no coincidence, but is a marvelous indication of how important folk life is to America and how it has had such a profound effect on not only our history, but our current values today, and it continues to influence who we are as a people, and is so critical, therefore, that these materials are collected as part of all the materials that are collected in what is, by de facto, America's National Library. And so it is really phenomenal to have the American Folklife Center be part and parcel of the very fabric of the Library of Congress. Now, it is almost a long-standing tradition in terms of an entity that was created in 1976 that various symposia be hosted by the AFC. And the one that we're here to celebrate and to learn at today and tomorrow is part of sort of a long tradition. The first one was held in 1990, and that was called Cultural Conservation, and that explored the theme of conserving cultural materials in an archive and other kinds of institutions. 10 years later, in 2000, there was a symposium held, Folk Heritage Collections in Crisis, and that focused on preservation of materials for the future, and it also had a very, very large focus on providing access to materials. And so today's symposium focuses on a little bit of a different theme, and that's networking and collaboration. And that's a fabulous theme for our times, because not only because of budget constraints, although they do fit into this equation, but because large and small institutions are doing innovative things all over the country and all over the world. And the Library of Congress, as part of that community, wants to bring people together so that we can share ideas. And to be quite frank, it's a little bit selfish. We want to learn from you. So we hope that everybody will take advantage of the opportunity to interact, to ask questions, and that you will look forward at the end of this symposium to the next one that we will meet again at, hopefully in the not too distant future. So I want to thank you again for coming, and I want to encourage you to be part of the Library of Congress community. We say that the library's function is to enlighten, educate, and entertain, and folklore collections fit all those bills perfectly. And so with that in mind, I'm going to ask Betsy to come back to the podium and officially start the learning, the education part of the day. Thank you again for being here.
Hi. First off, I need to say I'm not the educational outreach specialist. There are lots of us. But I did want to say thank you, and I'm glad to be here. You'll also notice that I walked up with an iPad and paper. This is going to be the first time I've ever done a speech with an iPad, so bear with me. If I need to switch back to the paper, I will. First, I want to thank Betsy Peterson, Kathy Kirst, and Bert Line for inviting me to participate in the symposium and sitting down with me a couple of times, and in Bert's case a third time, to talk to me about what was going on and about the symposium and to invite me to speak. I also especially have to thank Kathy Kirst, who was incredibly patient with me when I didn't get her the stuff that she needed in time. I have to think that there is a place for people who are conference coordinators who have to work their full-time job while also doing the equivalent of juggling 50 balls at the same time while walking down a greased hill. I must admit to being a bit of a newbie when it comes to the term cultural heritage. When I started thinking about cultural heritage and doing a little bit of reading, my mind first went to folklore. Now, I realize that folklore is one part of what is now the broader term cultural heritage, but for me, it was the door that I used to enter this world. Now, I must admit, I love folklore. I've always said that one of my dream jobs is to work reference the American Folklife Center. I adore local history, and I love hearing stories about communities, about behind-the-scene things, about why things became what they were. My friends know I love to knit, and you will see me knitting over the next day or so. And I love to go to craft shows, and I love to watch people make baskets, soap, do folk art, that sort of thing. I've also always admired the griots who knew all the stories, and in some cases, the really good dirt. But they also knew the community. They knew who had the herbs that could handle specific illnesses, who could do the best repairs, and who could make the best sweet potato bread in town. But collecting this history and these links to the culture of a community is sometimes difficult and occasionally impossible. When I was preparing for this talk, I read information from the IFLA website on cultural heritage, and the website said that culture is a basic need, that a community thrives through its cultural heritage. Culture provides a place where we go to get our strength. Understanding and accepting culture encourages growth. As Rory Turner said in his speech on cultural sustainability in 2010, though the culture forms and institutions we collectively create, we orient ourselves to interpretations of who we are, what our obligations to others are, what our relationship to nature is, even how we understand our destiny as beings within time and space, even to our ultimate purposes as souls. But how do we preserve culture? Some is passed down by family and friends through story, through action, and repetition, and through things such as photographs, recordings, and written documents. But what about those of us who want to study culture and understand how it strengthens our communities, or want to understand, to compare and contrast different cultures and see how the activities of one culture influence the next? And as I was writing that, I immediately thought of the blues and spiritual music of the African American South and how it influenced people like the Rolling Stones and some of the other groups from the 60s and 70s. How do we get those kinds of materials that are often held tightly into archives and other kinds of repositories? I have to say that I think since my first days as an archivist, I've attended a lot of sessions on going into the community and encouraging people to donate materials to repositories, or as the technology improved, to allow a repository to scan materials and let the person that holds those materials keep them in their possession. We want to make sure that archives include a variety of voices, of narratives and realities. We as archivists have figured out ways to preserve and provide access to these collections using varieties of technologies as simple as transcribing stories and as complex as creating digital surrogates that reside in the cloud. As was mentioned a second ago, in 2000, the Symposium on the Crisis in Folk Collections highlighted issues relating to preserving these materials. We've dealt with some of these issues relating to preservation, and we're working on improving our issues dealing with others. But I think there's some deeper issues that we need to deal with when it comes to acquiring and providing access to cultural heritage materials. There are some concerns within communities about providing access to their culture and allowing outsiders to collect and document both their tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Many relate to issues of trust. Will these materials be treated with care and honor? How will having collections and repositories impact the preservation of the community's heritage? Tom Nesmith notes that archivists play a role in memory creation by doing interpretation and providing controlled access through finding aids and other methods such as determining what will be digitized. I love this quote from Brian Brotham where he notes that Plato may have been right to warn that writing would destroy memory, for recording sanctions forgetfulness. Other community members may Other questions community members may have may include if these materials will be sold for profit without alerting other members of the community. Issues related to copyright. I attended a session with a bunch of the Folklife folks on copyright and cultural heritage materials last year, and some of the issues that are being discussed are fascinating, and I think some are a little bit intractable. On the other side, for those of us who are collecting these materials, we need to determine who speaks for the community. Who signs the papers, such as the deeds of gifts, and gives the permission? Who determines how materials should be treated, or if they can be donated, scanned, or made accessible? How do we answer these questions? One way we can do that is by building bridges with the communities, with materials that we want to collect and preserve. And we can deal with things such as the lack of trust. For example, showing how materials have been collected and preserved and how they continue to honor the heritage of the community. If the story will be, I knew I was going to mispronounce this, homogenized, that's the word I wanted. Will everything just be told in a very flat story? As I look at some of the images that are in American memory, I see the posing. I see how things were just said a certain way. And I know that people want the real story. They want their real lives and experiences to be out there and to be shown to the world. So we need to think about that. Will the materials be lost or not cared for? Like the Lost Ark in Indiana Jones. Will it go into a back corner somewhere far away? Or will it actually be out there and available for people to look at? How do we help the community understand the importance of preserving the materials? I think about a friend of mine that I've met through working through educational outreach, introduced me to another friend of his who is a trustee at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he was walking along in the office and he saw a bunch of things that were going to be tossed. And these materials were notes and minutes and pamphlets from the 50s and 60s. And the friend had him call me and say, "What should I do with this stuff?" And a part of me went, wait a minute. The community should know that material from Ebenezer Baptist Church from the middle of the Civil Rights Movement is vitally important and should be preserved. Why don't they know this? How do we let these people know about the importance? We need to think about the connections to the community. I went to a session at SAA this year on HipHop Archives. And we need to find the connections. We need to find the people who will work with us, who will help us to understand the language. But on the other end, we need to be able to talk to those people. We can't use words like provenance. I was looking and I was reading as I was preparing for this, and there's a term that has bedeviled me for years that I'm blanking out on right now. And I read something that explained what it was. Oh, informatics. And I'm like, what? I've never understood this. Why is this important? And I read and got a description in plain English, and I went, oh. So we need to discover plain English. I think we forget we are incredibly smart people. We've done the studying, we've done the research, we've got the skills. But we forget that maybe we're not talking to people who've done the research, who have the skills. So we need to be able to do that. We do need to determine who the leaders are and the decision makers. And we need to encourage collaboration and look at new different ways that the collections can be used. For example, the session I saw on HipHop Archives, they're going into prisons and taking these collections into various prisons and letting the people see the collections, learn about the history of hip-hop, create their own editions. They're going into the schools and using these materials as part of reading programs to get students to read more, to learn more. So we need to think about ways to interact, and I'll talk more about that in a second. However, in addition to building bridges with potential donors, we also need to look at other places where we need to build bridges. How do we connect with our supporters, with our users, and with others interested in cultural heritage? We must work with other communities that will allow us to show the importance of our collections, build collaboration, and build a basis for support now and the future. And here are some of the groups. The people that can tell our story. We need to be able to tell our story. We need to be able to confidently stand in front of donors, in front of funders, in front of a variety of different people, and tell our story, explain what we do, why we do it, why it's important. But in some cases, it's more important to have others tell our story. Not just funders, but influencers. If you have someone who's important tell your story, sometimes it reaches further. Note the READ campaign that the American Library Association has used for years. And you see the picture of Robert Pattinson reading Twilight. Or you see Neil Gaiman holding a book. And these are people that are famous, or in some cases, most of the people in the room know who they are. I realized I picked two more recent pop culture people and not historic ones, my apologies. But those posters are in libraries or other places, or some of the reading organizations got together and did a really cool commercial with a bouncy song done by the Roots, encouraging reading. We need to be doing that. We haven't figured out how to do that yet, but we need to find the people who will tell our stories. We need to find our champions. Who are the ones that can say, hey, this is important, this is good. We also need to go out and we need to show how we fit, where we fit, and how we support communities. It's been suggested that if archivists don't show where we fit in, we may be left out. So how do we make sure we stay in? We may be able to provide support, even if someone doesn't want to give their collections now, help them understand what they need to do to protect them. To provide technical assistance on the care and feeding of collections, and show how collections and other materials are better preserved by having us be involved in the conversation instead of being left out. I think about the new Director of Educational Outreach, Leanne Potter, and she talks about her connections to the records. She talks about what's the story behind the record, and how it plays a role in her life. I heard the Archivist of the United States talk about a letter he sent to a president and the response he got back, and it turned out that response is sitting in the National Archives. And suddenly, that big monolith, it has a human face. And we need to bring that human face. I think about a collection that's downstairs here, the Katherine Dunham papers. And my mom, who is a vibrant 79, wanted to be a dancer desperately and was offered a chance to dance with Katherine Dunham, and her parents told her she couldn't leave. So I look at that collection and I see why my mom was interested in dancing with Katherine Dunham, and why keeping this material and showing the vibrancy of these dances is so very, very important. Another group we need to be aware of is potential users. We need to make sure that scholars know about where our collections and where they're located. I'll mention a little bit more about National Folklore Archives Initiative, that I think is very important in helping us show where our collections are. A community that's close to my heart is the K-12 community. How many of you work regularly with students and teachers in your communities? Oh, we need more than that. We so need more than that. Most school districts in the United States are now following something called the Common Core State Standards. And within the Common Core State Standards, students are being asked to work with nonfiction materials that they can analyze and do critical study of. And where can you find nonfiction textual and non-textual materials that students can do analysis with? In every repository in this room. If you let people know that these materials are here, you can suddenly be right in the center of the educational activities of the United States and around the world. And suddenly there's a reason for you to exist because you're helping students gain their education. Participate in things like National History Day, which is now a worldwide phenomenon, not just something that's for the United States. Let people know that these materials are here and that students can use them. Yes, they need to be trained. Yes, they need to understand that an archive is different than a library, but you can do that. And if you are a one-person repository and you don't have the time to do that, write up a document that you can hand out so that you can continue your work, but also enable students to come in. The other thing is to think about keeping the importance of archives and cultural heritage in people. Remind people that culture is where we get our strength. It's where our backbone is. The last group I'll talk about is with each other, within the cultural heritage and archival community. A little story here. A few years ago, SAA was approached by the Native American Archives community to pass a set of Native American protocols of how material should be dealt with from Native American archives. And one of the things that was discussed was images of the ghost dance. And that within the description of the protocols, these materials were to be destroyed. And back then, I didn't have quite the knowledge I have about the importance of the ghost dance, about the issues related to the ghost dance. But I was going, wait a minute. Why do you want to keep these secret, and why do you want to destroy them? What happens if 100 years from now, someone wants to see these images? Someone doesn't know what the ghost dance is, and they want to study it, they want to understand it, or people within the community want to see images of it. Now, I understand better. I understand that some of the images were taken improperly, were taken surreptitiously, and then put out for public sale and things like that. But at the time, there was nobody out there who could explain that to me. I had to spend a lot of time trying to find those answers. Instead of people saying, no, this stuff can't be out here, no, this needs to be treated a certain way, we need to talk. We need to be able to talk to each other and say, the reason that this is a problem is this, and this. And then have a member of the archive community say, well, have you thought about this, and this? Are there solutions out there so that we can balance those two categories, those two areas? And I know we need to think about how we preserve a secret history. How do we deal with these cultural items that we need to keep behind closed doors because they're not for the public, but it is a part of our heritage, and we need to figure out if there's a way to do it, or if we risk the possibility of these materials just being lost. As I was going through and thinking about some of this, and I was doing research, and I knew about the American Folklore Society, but I didn't realize they had an archives and library section. And there's got to be a way that that part of the association and SAA and other organizations can work together. Haven't figured it out yet. It may be that it's a connection through one of our sections and roundtables or through the Cultural Heritage Working Group, which I'll talk about in a second. But there's got to be a way. We do need to bring groups together so that we're working towards our common good. A really good example of this that happened many years ago, and some of you in the room may have participated in this, was the National Forum for Archival Continuing Education. And this was a huge conference. We brought in people from all the regional and state archives associations. We brought in people from the American Library Association, from the Special Library Association, from AASLH, I mean, everywhere, to talk about how we could do effective professional development and how we could work together to ensure that people working with, in this case, archival materials, would all have the same training. It makes me really sad that we got some steps, but we didn't get far enough. There's gotta be a way to do something like that within the cultural heritage and the archives communities and the historical communities, because it's vital that we work together to preserve these materials. Excuse me. We need to know who has what. And I mentioned the National Folklore Archives Initiative. And we need to figure out, we need to continue to work and find funding beyond what's being given by NEH, thank you NEH, to keep doing this so that we can have something like the National Union list of manuscript collections or some of the other books and other materials that let us know where materials are so that our work as reference archivists, historians, librarians is easier, and so that we are supporting our researchers. Now, yeah, I'm president of SAA, and one of the things I heard during my conversations with Betsy, Kathy, and Bert is that SAA, we haven't been quite so attentive to this area. And one of the things that got mentioned was that SAA tends to be a little bit snotty. And that if you don't have training as an archivist, if you haven't gone to a graduate program, if you're not certified, if you haven't done these things, you're not really an archivist. I am standing in front of you to say I'm an accidental archivist. I did not go to school. I learned at the feet of a trained archivist who had not gone to school either. And when I started my career, certification was just getting off the ground, and I went, certification? This seems like a waste. So, I do not have a master's in archival studies, and I'm not certified. So, if I can stand up in front of you as the president of this national association, come in. If you're not feeling welcome, if you're not a member of SAA and you'd like to be, tell me. You will have I think my email address is in the information about everyone. Write me, because I want to know, because I want to say no. There are archivists of every stripe out there. And the idea is to make sure that we all have the training and the experience to make sure these records are preserved. I mentioned a second ago the Cultural Heritage Working Group, and Jennifer O'Neill, who will be speaking in the next group, is its chair. And as I understand it, in the past it was a little wobbly, but under Jennifer and Kelvin White's leadership, it's rocking. So I encourage you to talk to Jennifer and say, these are things we need to be that SAA needs to be exploring. These are things that we need to be thinking about, because the working group's goal is to let SAA Council know about specific issues so that we can act on them. SAA has just done a strategic plan. We just finished it, and our focus is on advocacy for archives and archivists, encouraging professional growth, working to advance professional knowledge, and encouraging collaboration with other partners. We want to ensure that our organizational values are met, and those include ensuring the diversity of its membership and its leaders, the profession and the archival record, fostering a culture of creativity and experimentation across the association, and providing an open, inclusive, and collaborative environment. That's really important to us. We sat in council and said that there are 7 values. These are 3 of our most important core values. We need you to hold us to that and to give us ideas on how to make sure that we hold to that. Another thing that came up as a discussion issue was advocacy. We have just recreated one of our working groups into a committee on advocacy and public policy. So we probably won't go into each state and advocate, but we'll give you the tools so that you can go to your state legislature and advocate. We sent a letter of support for the Georgia State Archives. There are people that are mad that we weren't front and center, but the reality is the activities for the Georgia State Archives needed to be led by, and in the front of the center, Georgia archivists. The legislature in Georgia was not going to listen to the Society of American Archivists. It was nice that we're there and there's a letter, but the Georgia people are the ones that elect them. So we want to make sure that we're here to give you the background information and the support so that you can do what you need to do to preserve your collections. What training do you need? The Digital Archive Specialist program that SAA is doing bang-up work, and it's giving training on how to deal with electronic records. But what else do you need? You need to let us know. We have education committees. We have other people who want to know what training is most important. What do we need to be providing, and how do we need to provide it? And I totally ignored the fact that we're trying to be digital. We are trying to be out there in social media. If you can't come to a conference, a session, or something because of cost, and you want something digital, there's going to be a cost. It may not be as much as paying to fly to wherever and stay in a hotel, plus pay for the session, but at least we'll be able to provide you the training and the material that you need where you live. I want to quote, I'm going to end with a bunch of quotes, so be prepared. I'm going to quote Brian Coomer, who has a really cool blog, and he says, "Archivists have an incredible opportunity to help shape cultural heritage in the way that we organize records, provide access to them, and perform our role in helping to preserve the memory of events, groups, places, and attitudes, as well as other aspects that make up culture. This will require archivists to learn to think a bit like a historian, relate to other cultures like an anthropologist, understand emerging technological trends like an IT specialist, and mediate between interest groups like a good politician." And I'm not going to make any comments because I'm here at the Library of Congress and I have to be neutral. And we need to make sure that the training is available so that we can ensure that we can meet these roles and that you can do your jobs. To end, I want to quote South African archivist Vern Harris where he says that archives are not the quiet retreat for professionals and scholars and craftspersons. They are a crucible of human experience, a battleground for meaning and significance, a babel of stories, a place and a space of complex and ever-shifting power plays. And to these places and spaces, we are working to bring the culture and heritage of our communities. We are building places that ensure that culture can continue to provide our strength and an opportunity for us to continue to grow. And I hope we'll find ways to do that together. Thank you. And I'm assuming either I'm being kicked off the stage or I'll have a moment for answering questions.
No, I was going to encourage you to stay up here, and we wanted to see if there were any questions.
Okay, in the back.
I'm not going to say it again. No, I'll say it quickly. You know, a lot of what you were discussing in relation to community partnerships, building relationships, building trust, making contacts is sort of fundamental to how folklorists, at least folklorists in the public sector, do their work. And it struck me that that's another excellent point of overlap and collaboration between the worlds of archives and the world of folkloristics. So that I just thank you for getting me thinking that way.
Thank you for your comment. Other questions? There's one in the corner, okay.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Just a quick question. Could you tell us a little bit more about these engagement with the HipHop Archives? It sounds absolutely fascinating, those projects that are developing.
The session that I went to at SAA had a person from the Smithsonian, a person from Cornell, and an actual hip-hop artist whose name I'm having... Thank you. Who I will say was absolutely amazing. And what Cornell is doing is they've gathered together material from the hip hop community, and they got a person who had some experience and has helped them to collect materials, but also started to do their outreach. The person from Smithsonian also talked about some of what they were doing. And then Martha talked about the issues in terms of making the hip-hop community comfortable with working within the archives. The archives community. I heard Deborah Richardson, who is from Smithsonian, who's one of the speakers, and Martha about hopefully continuing that for next year. But another place that has a very, very good archives program and is collecting hip-hop archives is UVA. Patrina Jackson is doing that, and as I understand it, they're doing some really good work and getting a lot of people interacting with the collection and using within schools and reaching out to a wider community than they ever thought possible. So I hope that, okay, outstanding. Other questions, comments, sharing, things that are cool, things that you want to let are cool that you want to do. Yes.
I was just wondering if there was a resolution with the materials concerning the ghosts that you mentioned.
I'm feeling very blank that I'm not remembering. I think the Native American protocols were passed by SAA. I don't know what the decision is going to be regarding the various images held by repositories relating to the ghost dance. I just remember having the conversation with someone who was very actively involved with the decision and going, that doesn't make sense to me. So I don't know what's happened with those images. I know that we have a couple of images on the LC website, including one that I think is a staged image that really is that really doesn't thrill me very much, but it's there. And I know that we've taken down we had something about the ghost dance and Wounded Knee on the website, and we got so many complaints that it came down. Okay.
Oh, hi, this is Jennifer. I was actually going to say that the protocols actually were not passed by SAA.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, and I can't speak directly about the ghost dance images, but I will say that specific to the protocols, they weren't passed by SAA, and they are currently being the original drafters of the protocols were trying to get those individuals back together to make updates, add case studies, and then to bring them back to SAA again once we've done that. So just to clarify, they actually, just wanted to make sure that people know they actually weren't passed by SAA.
See, I considered bringing Jennifer up here so she could talk, because she's really smart and really cool. So thank you, Jennifer. And there was over here, and then another one over there.
Just a real quick one. Could you say again the name of the South African artist who you quoted at the end of your?
Vern Harris. He's actually, remember the name of the book, Having Migments. He's written a couple of really fine books on archives, and he actually spoke at the conference in San Diego on tattoos and memory. It was a really talk. And person back here.
Yeah, the definition or the protections for cultural property in the United States obviously are different than in many other countries. And thus, I think a lot of items that would in other countries be included in collections that are owned by the people are in private hands. Does the SAA work, for example, with the leading auction houses to make sure that items that come up through the doors of an auction house, that at least libraries and archives know where these items will be located after they went up on the auction block?
SAA doesn't. I think some of the smaller regional and state associations are a little more attentive to that than we can be. SAA has a professional staff of 10, and then all the other officers, et cetera, are volunteers. And alas, as I said in my first blog post, I have my full-time paid job and my full-time unpaid job, and sometimes there's not enough time to do everything. So I will say that we have people that are within the profession that are really good at keeping an eye on what's going on. Karen Jefferson, who's I'm out and who's in here, was involved in the preservation of the Martin King papers in Atlanta when they went up. Was it Sotheby's? Yeah, with Sotheby's, and was able to, with a number of other archivists and others within the Atlanta community, to work together to get the funding to get papers and get them now into her archive. They are at Clark Atlanta, right?
Yes, they are actually the Morehouse College Martin Luther King collection. There are several Martin Luther King collections, so we have part of them. It's an interesting story. Anybody want to know? Karen and several other that were involved did a paper at SA a few years ago, and it is a fascinating story.
I have a
Okay.
a very practical comment or suggestion. I'm a dean of a college, and archives reports to me. I'm not an archivist. And if SAA might reach out to people like me who make decisions about funding at universities, it might be a good, a productive vehicle for getting more.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. What does the SA do to help other countries outside from the US regarding the profession?
Sadly, not a lot right now. That's one thing that's about to change. We have deferred in many cases to the International Council for Archivists, ICA, but we have an international group that's worked with, that works more with international issues. SAA has gotten quiet with that. We're getting less quiet. We've decided again to start getting involved with ICA again, and I think that's when you're going to start to see more involvement. We do write and correspond, and if there's an issue that's international in scope that relates to archives, we have written letters and encourage others to provide support, but we don't go into we don't go into countries and start pulling out archival collections or things like that. But we will offer support, we will offer training where we can, and do other kind of, for lack of a better term, peripheral activities. But it's changing, and we need people to help us know how we need to change.
Thank you. I don't know about the ghost dance in particular, but the ATALM, the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, over the past couple of years did a study and created a list of protocols that were published in a really nice document called Sustaining Tribal Cultural Heritage Archives or something. So that came from within the Native American communities and was a study across all of their own organizations.
And I think that brings up an important point. I mentioned a second ago that SAA is a staff of 10, plus the officers and a lot of volunteers. We can, if you make us aware of things, we may be able to help in some ways, but we're not going to solve everything. We are a small little organization. What we need are people to tell us where the issues are so that we can provide what help we can. There are other organizations and there are other groups that you may want to be aware of that can support you, including the regionals and state archival associations, the colleges and universities that have programs and so on. And again, going back to the issue of collaboration, we've got to work, we are but one group, and we are relatively small. However, if we bring in other groups that can make noise with us, we suddenly become stronger. So we need not just for people to say, this is happening. We need to know, who can we talk to? Are there other organizations we can partner with? Are there other people who have a better idea of what's going on and may have suggestions on how to best solve this issue? So being able to collaborate, being able to partner, being able to know who we can hand off to if there's an organization that can do the job better is vitally important. Other questions? Okay, thanks. I will be in and out since this is here and my office is just on the other side of the cafeteria. I have to do things like go to staff meetings. So I will be there. I will be around, and I look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
We're just going to move right ahead here, and as you know, coming off of the heels of Danna's discussion, I think this next session, it fits very nicely. Clearly, archivists, folklorists, oral historians, librarians, we are just but one set of stakeholders in the materials that we work with. People care passionately and fiercely about this material. Culture does matter. And so the next topic is users of cultural heritage archival materials, and I can't think of anyone better than Jennifer O'Neill to serve as the session chair for it. Jennifer is now with the University of Oregon Libraries, but is most recently from the Smithsonian NMAI, National Museum of the American Indian, and we're thrilled to have her and the rest of our panelists here, and so I'm just going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for being here today. It's so great to be back in DC and to look out at very familiar faces, and to also have the opportunity to meet new faces as well. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and a huge thanks first to the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center for hosting this important event, and of course to the staff for all their hard work in coordinating this symposium. I would like to especially thank Kathy Hurst, who has worked so diligently to coordinate all the logistics, travel and session details. She has went above and beyond all of these duties, and we can't thank her enough for all she's done. As Danna had mentioned earlier, there is a special place for these people who do all the logistics for these conferences, and we all know that this couldn't have happened without everyone's help. I also just wanted to mention briefly, because Danna had also mentioned a bit about the Native American Archives Roundtable and the Cultural Heritage Working Group, and I just wanted to do a quick plug that I'm the immediate past chair of the Native American Archives Roundtable, and within SAA we do work significantly with other groups, which is our role with that group, and try to do a lot of what she just recently mentioned, which is collaborate with other groups. We know that we are a larger entity, Society of American Archivists, but within that group, as the Native American Archives Roundtable, we try to reach out and work with other organizations and other groups, such as the Association for Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums, and do a lot with them. So within our own group, we're definitely doing a lot of collaborative work with different entities. And if you have ideas or if you have questions for us, feel free to come up to me, or there's also other members of the new steering committee, which our new vice chair, Gina Rappaport, who is at the National Anthropological Archives, she's also here today, and then also on the steering committee is Michael Pond from NMAI. So you have lots of people here today who can talk to you about those issues, or if you have questions. And then also in regards to the Cultural Heritage Working Group, as Danna also mentioned, I serve as the co-chair with Kelvin White, who he is at the University of Oklahoma. And again, if you have any questions about the work that we're doing or what we are pursuing, we would love to talk to you about that and share more information with you. And if you are curious about the work we're doing, you can find out lots of that information through the SAA's website, where we have a specific page just for the working group. So I just wanted to make sure to share that information. Most importantly, we serve as advocates for these issues, and that's also what I see as my role here today as the chair, an advocate for these issues and for these topics that are very near and dear to me. As the session chair, I'll be providing introductory remarks on this session on users of cultural heritage archives, and I'll provide a brief overview into the presentations to follow. After all the speakers, we will leave ample time for questions and discussion, as the presentations will be briefer, 5 to 7 minutes, and then we want to, of course, leave lots of time for discussion. So as we're going through the presentations, write down notes, things you want to ask, or any ideas that you may have at your own repositories. And while I'll highlight some of the presentations today and the individuals, you can find complete a session overview and biographies of each of our presenters today online. And so if you're curious about finding out more about these individuals, you can find it there. So the title of my talk this morning is Awakening Ideas, Engagement and Collaboration Between Cultural Heritage Collections and Users. And we've heard that topic or word a lot already today, collaboration and interaction. And so how I want to couch it today, though, is that collaboration in regards to our users, and not just collaboration with, say, the producers or the source communities. That is also a topic, but more in relation to who are the users of these materials. Cultural Heritage Archive collections contain unique materials that document specific aspects of a cultural's history, tradition, languages, and contemporary community-based initiatives, which are represented in a variety of mediums, such as documents, recordings, films, and photographs, just to name a few. These collections serve as valuable tools for preserving collective memory and knowledge that brings increased power to these source communities. Historically, within the archive profession, significant research and theoretical attention has been placed on the acquisition, management, and preservation of cultural heritage materials. However, in recent years, we've witnessed a gradual change to focus more specifically on a term called participatory archives, also including engagement and stewardship of archival collections with these source communities. Although the actual users of these collections is an inherent outcome of acquiring and preserving these collections, oftentimes it can be an afterthought or challenge when collections are opened or closed for use. This has led many to ask how repositories can proactively engage with a variety of users. And the variety of users can include academics, undergraduates, researchers, the general public, and more importantly, source communities where the collections come from. These users can inspire innovative projects, discussions, and ideas regarding the collections, and assist in the continued efforts of the life cycle of a collection. This networking with a variety of users regarding the collections ensures that these cultural heritage materials are disseminated to a wide range of viewpoints to continue to inspire and share the subject matter within the collection. In addition, these collaborations between repositories and users bring new uses of and reinterpretation of collections that highlight the importance of cultural heritage materials among source communities, as well as to others interested in researching the collections or may be interested in knowing more about these cultural heritage collections. Furthermore, this work highlights the evolving and challenging role of an archivist in managing these collections. If the archivist sees that perhaps a very valuable collection is sitting dormant in a repository, if possible, they should take that opportunity to reach out to possible users to ensure the collection continues to be utilized and circulated. Now, I do realize that not all archivists have the time to do this, but it should be something that's thought of in their daily interactions with users or with researchers, thinking, why is this certain collection not being used? Or how can we ensure that the information in this collection is shared if and when the source community wants that to happen? Just as the archival profession needed a paradigm shift regarding the participatory archives and stewardship with source communities, I think we also need a shift in the way we think about the inherent and possible users of cultural heritage collections. We must tie the users into the overall life cycle of the stewardship and collections management of these collections. You never know when there will be opportunities for educating users on cultural heritage and source communities and widening someone's eyes to actually what's in these collections and taking it as an opportunity to teach and educate. And you never know when the collections can bridge connections and can awaken these ideas for a community, a researcher, student, or the general public. Within this morning's session, you will have the opportunity to hear just about these types of innovative projects from a variety of different regions and countries, including the United States, Canada, Africa, and the United Kingdom. In addition, these projects represent a variety of different methods for engaging users with cultural heritage collections. We will first hear from Noel Lobley from the Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford, who will highlight collaborative ways in which recordings can circulate among source communities, especially using their own local source mechanisms, as well as how to consider ways of creating responsible and reciprocal communicative networks between academic institutions and source communities. We'll next hear from Amma Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, anyone, and Deborah Hollis, who will be presenting on innovative pedagogical uses of archival collections that involves undergraduates, active learning, historical research, and cultural heritage archives. Although academic archives are not normally seen as the domain of non-history majors, these two faculty members have reimagined the undergraduate research experience. And then Anna Briggs from Université Paris-Diderot from France will talk about the Record Project, The Sound of the Sea and the Silence of Film, which highlights the student-recorded oral history project with members of the whole fishing industry to acquire new data, contextualize information for older collections, and create a link between academic users and a post-industrial community, thus reinterpreting their past and future, as well as forming a unique education experience for new, more active generation of archive users. Maryna Chernyavska from the University of Alberta, Canada, will be presenting on givers, users, and research subjects of the Ukrainian Folklore Archives at the University of Alberta, specifically highlighting what are the possibilities when an archive has such substantial support from a source community, such as the Ukrainian-Canadian community, and what occurs when these users, the source community or the donors, and the research subjects. How do these different roles shape the archival collections and impact the acquisition and preservation priorities? Then we'll finally hear from Dreanna Belden, who will be representing her work, and Kathleen Murray, about where do users find value. She'll be exploring the impact and value of digitized resources for users of the Portal to Texas History, a collaborative digital library with cultural heritage materials. They found interesting results from studies and surveys regarding the demographics of Portal users, as well as their views on different dimensions of impact of the resources in the way the materials were used and valued, thus challenging their assumptions of who they thought the users would be or how they would use the materials. So we have a very interesting session set out for you today, and again, we're going to leave lots of questions at the end for discussion, so we'll do all of those questions and discussion at the very end after all of the presentations. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Noel.
Hello, thanks Jennifer, thanks to Kathy, thanks to the two Johns, thanks to all the organisers. My name's Noel, I work as the ethnomusicologist and sound curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is the University of Oxford's Museum of Anthropology and World Archaeology. And in the next 6-7 minutes, I want to talk about 2 case studies of applied sound curation projects designed to build relationships between sound archives and the communities who've actually been recorded. The first collection is Hugh Tracy's Sound of Africa series, housed at the International Library of African Music, a major resource of sub-Saharan African field recordings, and a large recording of Bayaka music, currently curated at the Pitt Rivers Museum, recorded by Louis Sarno across the last 30 years. The main issue I'm thinking about here is that these are 2 collections of recordings that were explicitly made for the benefit of the African musicians who've been recorded. It was quite explicit at the time that these collections were built up. So to start with my first case study, Hugh Tracy's Sound of Africa series, I'm sure some of you know about this. A major resource, about 30,000 recordings recorded between the 1920s and 70s by Hugh Tracy, housed in the International Library of African Music, which is in Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. A very ambitious project designed to try and codify the entire continent. It's a big place, but he had a go. Finished in about the 70s, but stated in rhetoric that these recordings, which were made at a time of massive social change, rural to urban migration, were for the benefit of the musicians, and they should be there for them, and largely it hasn't happened to date. Why is that? Well, to simplify really, an institutional archive, doesn't have much relationship to musical realities, social realities of the musicians. Ilam is in a Xhosa-speaking region in the Eastern Cape. Most musicians are likely to live in the township, somewhere like this. They're cluttered, they're poor, they're disenfranchised. They're not interested in coming into an archive. It's just not their world. Tracy recorded about 200 Xhosa songs in the 1950s, some recorded in regions very close to what you can see here, Fingo Village Township, including one musician who lives opposite this building as well. And it's fair to say most of these musicians don't know these recordings exist, and it's more or less on their doorstep. There's obviously a breakdown between the archive and source communities. Having spent a year in 2008 working through the International Library of African Music and hanging out with musicians, you can see Nyakonzima Tsana on the right here, Tera Tiota on the left. And I said, are you interested in these recordings? Did you know they exist? And they're like, yes, bring them to us. And I'm like, well, why do people don't know? And they said, if you want these heard, the best thing you can do is hire a donkey cart. I'll round up my musician friends. We'll learn the songs. We'll tour the township singing them. We'll set up a PA system, DJ them. Then people will come. And I thought, okay, I'm up for that. We'll do that. And we spent, and sure enough, it happened. We followed this as a method, and it struck me that this is about reinserting recordings back in local social mechanisms, the way that people actually experience their music making. So here's Nyaki and Tera, they're playing recordings to children and telling them what they know about them. This is Mgani, a street activist and poet, this is at the end of this donkey cart session. He set up a PA system. He's DJing the recordings alongside hip-hop, house, ragga, the music that they play, telling stories, and people came. He said, these are our songs, these are our Xhosa heritage, are you interested? And elders came forward and competed about the ideas and the different versions of the stories. So if you go to ceremonies, this is an Mgidi initiation ceremony, you will hear songs that are the same as Tracy recorded 50 years ago. And the moment you bring songs back into those situations, there's a different story from every person about what that... So Tracy said Somagwaza, a song which I'm not going to have time to play. It was a praise song for a cattle after he'd slaughtered a chief, and nobody I met agreed with that. There was 100 versions to every person that heard it told you something different. So, and these are ongoing projects, inserting recordings back in the way people actually experience their music making. This led into the current ongoing project with Bayaka Music, our archive, which was all digitised as part of a bigger project called Reel to Reel at the Pitt Rivers Museum. The main collection I'm going to talk about today is this Bayaka archive, recorded by Louis Sano. For those that don't know, from New Jersey in 1985, fell in love with Bayaka music, disappeared to the Central African Republic to record the music and never came back. It's still out there and has continued across 30 years to send us the recordings, documentation. It's unprecedented in terms of its scope. The entire music making, the entire range of music making of a single community across more than a generation has been recorded based on permanent living with a community. Okay, that's great. So he's recorded everything. This is the Ngwindi earth bow. I play it to students, they think it sounds like dubstep. A community that work with the sonic properties of the environment, has recorded ceremonies, all the range of instrumentation, ceremonies that go on for months sometimes. It's all and he's documented the relationship between music and space as well. This collection of recordings was explicitly made for the benefit of Bayaka musicians and communities as well. This was quite clear when it was donated to the Pitt Rivers Museum. But when I turned up 8 years ago to work on it, it was in a suitcase wrapped in a really bad old jumper that had been in the rainforest for years. The collection was just unusable. It's taken 8 years to bring it to the surface. The first thing to do was to bring the collector over for a month. And this is us working on it together about a year ago, going through, documenting, finding out what's actually in the recordings, priorities, etc. And one priority that was first identified was Ijengi recordings. Ijengi is an initiation ceremony. You can see the Ijengi spirit there. These can go on for months, sometimes, these ceremonies. It's beginning to erode quite severely, this ceremony, in and around Yandumbe, where the community here live. The Sano took old recordings back after he'd come with us on CDR and recirculated them, and it led to a renewed vigour on the performance. It led to stages that had been forgotten to be reperformed again. Turned into a web resource. And then, as we're thinking through how to deliver this back in the Central African Republic, we put together designs for delivery of ethnographic sound workshop. These are digital experts. It excites them, the thought of streaming back in the rainforest where there's no internet connection. This is a technical challenge for them, so we've begun to think this through. There is a museum back in Bangui, but if you follow the news, rebels have overthrown the government. This is what you're going to see. The Bayaka community were forced to flee into the rainforest. Sano posted this on Facebook. They're refugees in their own country. With this in mind, pre-field work, we decided to use the recordings to raise awareness of issues like this. So we've used the entire galleries of the Pitt Rivers Museum to broadcast the sound in the dark, invite people in to come and experience the music, given torches as they're bathed in the sound. And these nights we do, the next one is on November the 22nd. We stream them live, and it raises awareness of the community in the recordings. And thousands of people come into this as well. It's putting together a network of healthcare providers, politicians, famous musicians are interested in supporting this. We streamed it live. It was watched back in the Central African Republic. Louis Sano and the Bayaka community walked for an hour through the rainforest to access an internet connection via a WWF satellite phone, and we're immensely proud to hear this being curated, identified songs, and suggested songs they wanted to go back to them, songs that we should be curating and playing in public in future. I'm out of time now, so I'm going to finish there as well, but these are a couple of ideas about how we're taking archives and putting them back in different interactive ways and back with communities. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
And the show must go on. Over the past 15 years, a variety of disciplines, including my own of performance studies, have become preoccupied with the archive. Anxieties of what to do with the archive and archival materials have been expressed through questions like, how exactly do historians put emotion back into the inanimate text they read? And how can we think about performance in historical terms when the archive cannot capture the live event? And my answer to both is simple: perform the archive. Performance is more than just the arts, theater, film, dance, etc., but as Diana Taylor configures, it is a way of knowing through embodied practice. In the case of the archive, I propose that performance can be a way of knowing archival documents, intention, meaning, and the archive itself. We can perform the archive, not simply as an interpretive tool like historical reenactors at historic sites or documentary films, but as a performance-centered methodology of studying the past. What happens when we use our own bodies and present-day practices to become proxies for the archive? When our bodies become the place where firsthand evidence from the past is stored in and accessed through flesh, breath, thought, speech, movement, and interaction. One historical event has offered me the opportunity to seek answers to these questions: the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Using collections from over 20 institutions, I've sought to recoup from the archive African and African American performance in this World's Fair through verbatim reconstructions and playful experiments that resurrect the affect of the past. And I'm in the process of curating these experimentations into a brand new professional musical production titled At Buffalo. Working with students and professionals at NYU's School of the Arts, UC Berkeley, and the University of Colorado Boulder, I combined performance techniques commonly used in creative arts like acting, songwriting, choreography, filmmaking, you name it. I use such techniques as part of the analysis of archival material. The results have been translations of the archive into live events, living, breathing research sites that can also be analyzed, read, and interpreted. For example, one of the most famous performers of this fair was Laughing Ben Ellington, a former slave performing in an attraction called The Old Plantation, featuring 150 Southern blacks recreating scenes of slavery. Now, Laughing Ben was deemed, quote, the greatest laughing genius known to the country because of his ability to laugh loudly and frequently for 1 full minute each time. How do we make sense of such a laughing act when the only known archival material we have today include 2 photographs, a handful of newspaper descriptions, and this silent film clip housed right here in the Library of Congress's paper print collection? We turn to performance. Because a laugh requires the body, a torso to contain it, breath to yield its creation, and vocal cords to produce its pitch. A performance-centered methodology asks, what does it take to laugh for 30 seconds? What happens to the body, to Ben's body? Working with performing artists, I've discovered that it is no small feat to laugh on cue, loudly, or for an extended period length of time. Laugh too long, it can become painful to the body, leaving one gasping for air. That somatic knowledge can be used in surprising ways to make arguments about the stakes of Ben's laughing act. In a university context, the musical and these experimentations have opened up pedagogical strategies for teaching historical methods. It flourishes in a workshop setting where the classroom functions as a laboratory to create new theories about historical events, a rehearsal studio to test those theories, and finally, a stage to present to live audiences the results of that experimentation.
As Amma notes, many disciplines have examined the use of archives over the last 15 years. In my area, the scholarship of teaching and learning, educators have long deliberated the need to reimagine undergraduate education. Specifically, archives and libraries are challenged to do more to teach research skills necessary for lifelong learning. In 1998, the Boyer Commission on Educating Undergraduates in the Research University issued its report, Reinventing Undergraduate Education, with 10 recommendations focused on creating an active learning environment. In higher education, archives and special collections can offer archival collections for course assignments, independent studies, and internships. I matched 2 talented and curious CU Boulder undergraduates with the personal papers of a 20th century poet, radio personality, and Lewis Carroll scholar, Miss Florence Becker-Lennon. An active learning opportunity unfolded that combined the teaching of research skills with a multimedia project. Our students, one a film studies major, the other an art history major, had never handled an archival collection, did not know what one might contain, nor were either familiar with finding aids to uncover the collection's contents. Through this experience, they discovered Florence's poetry and scholarship and listened to tapes of the Enjoyment of Poetry radio program, which she hosted in both Boulder and New York City. The students dove into the collection and explored her story. Florence's New York radio show ran from 1956 to 1964 during the height of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, and she deposited copies of her interviews with the Archive of Recorded Poetry and Literature here at the Library of Congress. Florence interviewed women and minority authors long before they'd achieved recognition and fame. Poets such as Anne Sexton and Langston Hughes, and those who would later become the nation's poet laureates such as William J. Smith and Gwendolyn Brooks, were some of Florence's early guests. The students produced a 10-minute video that performed Florence's literary history from their 21st century point of view. The student-directed video, entitled Using Her Words, the Florence Becker-Lennon Story, puts archival collections at the center of student learning. Florence's words, that is, her papers, provide the ingredients for students to learn history and poetry in a creative manner. What makes this type of project possible is that many of today's students have rudimentary filming skills. Most are not technophobes and like to try new things. This type of project can have one student well-versed in the technology who teaches classmates in a peer assistant manner. Keeping copyright and permissions in mind, our students recommended other uses of archival collections, such as animating an author's work, creating a graphic novel, designing a performance piece, or creating a printed book, magazine, or ebook. Our film studies major, Louis Zeller, and a new CU alum, observed that the archive is a rich source for film studies projects. When discussing the success of his video chapter, he proclaimed, quote, "Everything I needed was in the library," unquote.
So when performance meets the archive.
And undergraduates are connected to archival materials.
Innovative uses are the inevitable result.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My presentation concerns a pilot project called Record that I managed whilst working as education officer at the Yorkshire Film Archive in the UK. The core of this collection is local and amateur industrial footage. The audience is fairly typical: academics, broadcasters, and local people interested in regional history. But the international relevance of industrial, social, and political history of Northern England, which is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, also attracts a number of unusual users. The archive's policy was to set up pilot projects to research, deliver, and evaluate outreach programs, especially with groups who seldom access film or archival collections. Our main activity was to develop an online moving image resource for teachers and students, but we also worked with homeless shelters, the military, contemporary art galleries, amongst others. Another goal was to collect new films produced during these outreach activities. So in this manner, we acquired a number of documentaries, animation, and experimental films. Film literacy was at the core of our work. We hoped people would not only watch these regional films, but that they would acquire the skills to understand and express themselves with the language of moving images and engage with their form and content in an informed, critical, and creative manner. Particularly in the case of amateur film collections, which are often the object of overly simple or even naive analyses, I felt that the depositor's participation in the curatorial process should be emphasized. Even though sound recording equipment became lighter and easier to use as film and then magnetic equipment evolved, many amateur filmmakers continue to make silent films for technical and aesthetic reasons. So I devised a project to explore the sounds, the language, and music that might accompany such silent images. I worked with the history, linguistics, and film departments of York St. John's University, where the archive is housed, commissioning small groups of students to work in interdisciplinary teams to research a collection, undertake oral history interviews, and create documentaries capturing a local dialect, folk music, or an accent. The students chose to investigate the city of Hull, which used to be a major whaling and fishing center that had gone through post-industrial decline and only recently begun to document its history and develop very innovative heritage programs. Unfortunately, the film department dropped out of the project at the last minute, so some of the students' work tended towards guerrilla filmmaking or gonzo journalism with borrowed equipment and rash editing. So now I would like to show you a clip from the most successful documentary that was produced.
One interview, did you used to sing sea shanties? I said, did we? We used to tune in and listen to the American Forces Network with the Patsy Cline and all those people. Those were the music of my days in the 40s, 50s, 60s and whatever. The music you may be thinking about goes back to the old days of sail and the clipper ships.
So although the students gave a positive evaluation of the program and of its educational benefits, this clip highlights a number of interesting issues. Firstly, this group expected the fisherman to be, well, the ex-fisherman, to be a vessel of local folklore, and he surprised the students by saying he didn't know any sea shanties, as he grew up listening to American music and collected Jimmy Rogers records. Yet they decided to record local folk musicians who were indirectly related to that history to capture the music they felt related to the images and illustrated them. Another issue was the editing of the sounds and images. The students matched the folk music to the footage they considered the oldest because it is in black and white, even though they aren't chronologically related, which raised the question of a conflict between archival control and historical accuracy on the one hand, and the creative freedom of users on the other. This problem of the creative freedom and archival control fueled ethical discussions about many of the archive's partnerships and collaborations. We found that in most cases, users, when guided by contextual information, film literacy training, and in some cases a contact with the collection depositors, were respectful of the rights of authors, donors, and the communities from which the films originated. A further issue was the value of the contextual information provided by the descendants of those who made or figured in the films. In the case of home movies, the personal details supplied by the filmmakers' children provide invaluable information for an enhanced understanding of these documents. But in a region whose identity was reshaped by the social and cultural consequences of rapid and traumatic post-industrial decline, the stories of industrial communities can become distorted by contemporary interpretations that can be pessimistic, nostalgic, or even revisionist. However, in this case, the interviewee's account of events was fairly objective, as the harsh realities of both past and present provided a fruitful comparative framework. One dimension that was absent in the project, probably due to the lack of film students, was a critical analysis of the source material and of the use of moving images as a medium for research. Film was the source, process, and final product of the work, yet students failed, even after having taken part in a specialized seminar, to make a distinction between amateur, industrial, and ethnographic genres, or between the codes of documentary and fiction film. So to sum up, the interdisciplinary nature of the project proved to be the greatest challenge. As a moving image archivist trained in program focused on the curatorship of fiction film and broadcast material, and subsequently self-trained in non-fiction and amateur film preservation and oral history practice, I found it difficult to supervise a program in which historiographical, aesthetic, and ethnographic issues could all be satisfactorily explored. Furthermore, the limited resource of such small archival organizations prevent experimental programs such as these from becoming permanent outreach initiatives. In the case of the Yorkshire Film Archive, the continued existence of these pilot projects was impeded due to drastic government cuts in both project and long-term funding. So whilst archival users in this economic framework might acquire unusual skills, engage with rare documents, and become parts of new communities when they participate in such temporary projects, it seems the unstable cultural and social programming of many smaller organizations forms a barrier against a lasting and enriching dialogue between communities of origin and users. Thank you.
Ukrainian folklore archives at the University of Alberta were founded in 1977 when Bogdan Medvitsky assembled students' fieldwork project from the first course in Ukrainian folklore at the University of Alberta. Since that time, the first folklore course turned into degree programs in Ukrainian folklore, BA, and PhD. And the archives have grown to the largest North American repository of Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Canadian traditional culture materials. There are more than 1 million Ukrainians in Canada. Ukrainians started immigrating to Canada at the beginning of 1890s and settled mostly on the prairie provinces. Most of the first immigrants until after the Second World War were peasants who, soon after they settled, started building schools, churches, and community halls to satisfy their spiritual, intellectual, artistic, and social needs. The Ukrainian-Canadian community is active and vibrant today. There are numerous organizations such as Ukrainian Scout Organization PLAST, Ukrainian Youth Association, Ukrainian National Federation, Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, and others. In Edmonton alone, and you must remember it's just 1 million citizens, there are several Ukrainian bilingual schools, 15 Ukrainian churches, about 30 Ukrainian dance groups, more than 10 Ukrainian choirs, and 3 Ukrainian museums. Our policy declares documenting Ukrainian-Canadian cultural heritage to be of a special interest. The Ukrainian folklore archives exist to a great extent due to the generosity of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. Our relationships are intimately close and complex. Ukrainian Canadians frequently donate materials related to various social and cultural aspects of Ukrainian Canadian community life, including immigration, religion, education, music, art, and folklore. At the same time, Ukrainian Canadians frequently approach the archives to learn true and authentic folk traditions from us. They trust our expertise in folklore. For example, organizing summer solstice celebration and trying to bring a Ukrainian flavor into it, people came to the archives for ideas. Another example is an inquiry from a lady. She came to ask about wedding customs from a specific ethnographic region in Ukraine. And the reason she wanted to organize her daughter's wedding according to the documented archival records, the way it was in the same region where her ancestors came from. One more example of addressing the archives to approve and improve one's heritage activities was a person who asked about a ritual song that is normally performed by Ukrainians at funerals, both in Ukraine and Canada. It is in Ukrainian language, and people sing it even if they don't speak Ukrainian, without understanding the words, simply repeating what they hear. The person had been singing this for years and naturally memorized the lyrics, but wanted to understand the meaning and confirm pronunciation of some words. We as outsiders were a safe source of inquiry for her. We wouldn't judge her knowledge of the language or the lack of such. As the Ukrainian folklore archives are also associated with the Ukrainian folklore degree programs at the university, Ukrainian Canadians are also the research subjects for our graduate students and faculty. They are the folk we study and collect materials from. We at the archives aspire to be inclusive and document not only traditions of the past, but also local histories, food lore, performing arts, and many other forms of folk life today. However, the goal of the community to preserve old, authentic traditions, promote its heritage, contrasts with the archive's goal to document living traditions in the broadest sense. The community believes that traditions should necessarily be old. Ukrainian Canadians utilize their traditions to construct and express their ethnic and national identity through their Ukrainianness. For Ukrainian Canadians, it is important to donate material that would represent Ukrainians as the people, as the whole nation, in an attractive and noble way. If it is a folk art piece, it has to be the most elaborate work. Donating another dozen of intricate Easter eggs is considered much more valuable than giving a creative recycled piece of art. If it is about beliefs, it has to be about faith, and necessarily the right one, official religion, either Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian Orthodox. If it is about folk songs, they should be old and authentic songs, and not the rhyme that young Ukrainian Canadians are passing along while partying. Interpreting symbols in a desirable way helps prove that Ukrainians trace their roots from the ancient civilization, from trillions. Decoding the lyrics of the old folk songs in a creative way supports the idea that Ukrainians always honor the woman, a mother, and so on. Everything old is important. It is always about continuity and never about change. Material culture, especially arts and crafts, being of the least interest to our archives, Because of the space limits, as well as availability of numerous and more appropriate, in this case, Ukrainian museums in Edmonton, is prioritized and considered to be the safest type of donation because it allows free and unlimited interpretation of their symbolic value, of the cultural traditions and their meanings. On the contrary, sharing stories that reveal belief in, let's say, supernatural is thought to be the least favorable because it requires admitting that in spite of being educated, Ukrainians might believe in other things than official religion or scientific evidence. So these multiple roles performed by Ukrainian Canadian community in relation to the Ukrainian Folklore Archives shape the archival collections to some extent. They impact what we collect, how we manage the records, what we digitize, and also touch on some very important ethical issues. Thank you.
Good morning. Kathleen Murray, who is my colleague and co-researcher and partner in crime for many years, has retired. But my presentation today is based on research we've been doing for years in the users of our digital library systems. Our conversation today centers on cultural heritage institutions and understanding the intersection and the interactions that we have with community users with our collections. But our question is, how do we begin to understand that when the interactions we're having with our community of users happens online? The folks that use our collection are from all over the world, and trying to put a human face on that is a challenge that we've been looking into for a few years. The Portal to Texas History, basically where we're from, we're at UNT. We are the 25th largest university in the US, and our libraries serve a population of over 36,000 students. We also serve a worldwide audience with our digital library systems. The Portal is a collaborative digital library. We have over 250 partners throughout our states that are various archives, libraries, and museums. And those partners range from folks like the Center for American History at UT to the Wolf Creek Heritage Museum in Lipscomb, Texas, which is a town with a population of just 44 people. And our collections started about 10 years ago. We have online over 300,000 unique historical items comprising about 3.5 million pages up for free public access. And every month, over 600,000 people are using the items in our collection. So it's a big question to consider. We've been doing a number of different types of research. We've done surveys with our users, with our partners, with scholars who have cited our resources for their scholarship and for publications they've done. And also we have some other data sets we've looked at. So the first step, which I will talk about here shortly, is coming up with a common framework for understanding these various data sets and surveys. But for this talking about today, we're looking at our user survey, which was launched in May of 2012, and we gathered responses for 4 months, and we had over 573 respondents. We got these folks through our newspaper invitation, also put a link up on our website, and also did a Facebook announcement about inviting them to participate. The common framework that we came up with is based and arises from some just funded research that happened in 2011, inspiring research, inspiring scholarship. And we came up with these terms that we thought kind of captured the dimensions of value and the places where we're having impact with online users. The first aspect is research. So not only were we gathering quantitative information from our users on how are these things valuable to you for these various dimensions, but also solicited comments from them, of which we received thousands. And we spent many hours analyzing and coding these comments and putting them into these dimensions. And research basically covers the way that people are using these to find answers, to create publications, to cite these in their works. The educational aspects focus on how are people using this for curriculum in the classroom, providing primary resources for students that are doing work, our school children citing these publications for their papers. And another dimension that was of use to our users was a financial area. We heard from folks that are retirees, they're on a fixed income. They don't have the resources to travel to go see these things they would like to interact with. And also we heard from institutions who are basically saying because we provide free public access to these things online, it's driving their collection development decisions because they won't buy something if it's already accessible for their users. And another aspect is cultural. The fact that we do feel like we're doing something useful and our users agree with this. Putting things online is a public good. It's a good thing to do. It's useful. People like understanding how life was 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and they find value in those aspects as well. And there are also social aspects of people are using this material and doing online conversations with it on different social media platforms. People are tweeting content from our collections, talking about it on Facebook. And we also heard from users who are having conversations in their communities, who are starting discussions with their family, their grandchildren, about society, culture, their family, and really interacting that way with these materials. And they find value in that way. And lastly, the other dimension of value for our users is just the environmental impact of having these resources online. Reduces travel, less of a carbon footprint, and it's just a thing that they have found another way of looking at value. So who are these users? We had 573 respondents. If you work in an archives or library, you know that a lot of our patrons are genealogists. They're doing family history research, and having this online in a virtual environment is no different. We have a lot of genealogists that use our site, and we've done a lot of usability study with those folks, understanding what their needs are. Also lifelong learners, historians, some librarians, and of course students as well. One thing that I did find surprising is that nearly 75% of our users are age 50 and over. I believe 18% of those are over the age of 70. This did surprise me. You would think there'd be more young folks at a big university, but a lot of our people that are using these all over the world are just happen to be older folks. And this is the number that really did astound me. In a country where 31% of the folks that live here have a 4-year college degree, 70% of the users of our digital resources have at least a 4-year degree. That's an incredibly well-educated group, and the implications for that I can't even begin to understand. And another question we ask is, how frequently are you using these resources? And folks are using them a lot. 5% are using them every day, 27% every week, and 28% of those are using it at least monthly. So that's a lot of usage from a lot of people who are using it repeatedly. And we did find a relationship between those things. Another question we asked was, how do you value these resources? And only 4% said there was little or no value, but also 10% said it was moderate, and most people said, 51%, it's a huge value having these things online. And there is a direct relationship, a strong relationship between how often people use our resources and how much they value those. So I did really appreciate this morning the comments by Danna Bell and how she talked about how we need to tell our stories. When you have an online environment, trying to tell those stories when you have no actual physical interaction with your patrons, this survey gives us a way of sharing the value of what we do and how people find value in that. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our presenters. You've been able to hear a variety of different methods and ways that users are either actually physically using the collections or virtually using the collections, and just a variety of different methods and ways that we are being able to share and interact with these collections. And you've also heard some different challenges or issues that may have come up with these different projects. So we're leaving lots of time here for questions. But before we start, I actually wanted to pose one question to the panel here before we turn it over to the audience. I heard from, I think it was Anna, and then lastly from Dreanna, a couple things that surprised them about their experience with their users. And so I just wanted to ask the rest of the session presenters if they could talk a bit about some other things that surprised them about their experiences with their projects, or anything that was also another challenge for them. Because I think what's most important with a lot of these projects is to learn from a lot of these different ideas so that we can take those back to our own repositories. So do we have, oh good, we do have microphones.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Oh, good. So I'm going to just turn it over to the panel, whoever wants to start. And again, if you could just touch on some of the challenges or things that surprised you in your projects and interaction with the users.
Well, I'll go. And in my case, I have to admit, given that the students and I were working with radio broadcasts,
we had permission from Florence's side of the family, but I have to admit I forgot the very critical step of having to get permission of each of her, from the estates or living relatives from each of her guests. So that really slowed the process down. But it was an incredible and valuable learning opportunity because the students didn't get that at first at all and were very turned off. So we had many discussions on the importance of seeking permission and copyright. And you see that their point of view was very rapid fire imagery, and Anna refers to it that there were differences of opinion, and then I decided to back off and not try to overtake their creative energy, and they were really happy with the way they scanned images and then put them in such a manner that the audience could get vertigo almost by watching certain portions. But they also learned how to interview and develop the interview questions for the different people who knew Florence. So the whole experience, while positive, had also challenges of sound, how to get the sound on the film. And that's where I couldn't provide any expertise, but there were campus IT resources and colleagues who were able to help.
I think to also just piggyback on Deborah's point about permissions, there are two things that come to mind for challenges with our work. You know, the first is truly in the permissions area, a lot of the archival institutions have high charges for the use of the material. And because we're literally performing as much material as we can as part of experimentation, that's actually been an interesting barrier to encounter. So it raises a question of true access when you have innovative uses of the archival material that maybe it's not appearing in a scholarly journal, scholarly publication. We're still going through several contracts with archival institutions for the show, and it's hung up precisely because of the crazy ways in which we're using the material. They don't know where to place us. So that's one. And then number two, in performing the archive, this is a challenge, but also a wonderful revelation of a problem of the archive itself becomes very palpable when you are, when you choose which archive to engage, which archive to put on stage. There's already a privileging of a story happening. But what we encountered was, you know, with this fair dealing with Black performance, a lot of what was documented were not done by the African or African-American performers. So when we perform the archive, we're not performing history as it was, but history as it's been documented. And the audience and the actors have to wrestle with the silences of the archive, what's missing. And that actually becomes a really wonderful, fruitful area for discovery for us. Discovering what do you do when the archive misses something with a gap. And I think performance is allowing us to fill in those gaps in ways that have become quite surprising for us.
Just to build on that as well, this idea of performing the archive with the two case studies I talked about with the different sound archives and practical circulation of them, this is exactly the thing that's missing. You asked what was surprising. It surprised me that local musicians 15 minutes away from an archive didn't even know their heritage was in there. Not only did they not use it, they didn't even know it was in there. So it's all about the context that you put it back in as well. So they were re-performing that archive. They, you know, hip-hop artists were starting to teach kids the songs and things like this, and but they didn't know it existed. And elders would say, the kids aren't interested. And the kids would say, the elders don't teach us. But they both agreed when they started to listen to the recordings that these were really important. People were in tears. They demanded access. As my friend, a hip-hop activist, Oli Lemadinda, said, yes, you raise awareness and we take action, you know, and so, you know, the best thing you can do is empower the artists to use this resource. And in terms of surprise use with the Bayaka archive, so our sound collections at the Pit Rivers, I knew that I wanted to put as much as possible on SoundCloud, which is a well-known sound delivery platform, for many reasons. It's very simple, it's very usable, but also it puts you alongside unexpected audiences. So already it's brought our Bayaka Sound Archive to the attention of some very, very famous musicians who have expressed an interest in helping. And we hosted a global hip-hop event recently, a film about the international hip-hop industry, brought in a load of local hip-hop artists, and they went away completely energized by Bayaka music because some of the storytelling forms, this form called Ghana, it's hip-hop, They all sit down, they lay down a rhythm. It's beatboxing, it's storytelling. It's like they got it. They got that. These guys in the forest, they're doing hip hop as well, you know. And so they went away and took an interest in the community and their music making. And you can't always predict those connections, but you have to be open to what you put your collections alongside. I think, yeah.
Just wanted to support that. What my colleague just said about raising awareness about the archives. It is not just about the archives, but also about folklore archives. When people hear folklore archive, I don't know how it is in the States, but in Canada they think, oh, I don't know, some old women singing something and that's probably it. And we collect many more materials, many more different types of materials. So raising awareness of what folk life is, what folklore is, and what we document, and that we are interested in your everyday customs and rituals, that's a big challenge, I'd say.
Yeah, and an unexpected use of our collections. I mentioned in my presentation the Wolf Creek Heritage Museum in Lipscomb, Texas, population 44. And their collection we put online was just a few hundred local history photos, but they have a worldwide reach now, and folks that never knew about them before can see those. So one outcome of that was Ken Burns, when he was doing the Dust Bowl, Florentine Films, his researchers, found these images online of the Dust Bowl in the Wolf Creek Heritage Museum and actually flew a research team out to visit them and license some of their images for the documentary. So these things are having an impact in changing research, changing people's lives.
Great. Well, okay, now that we've heard from our presenters again, I'd like to turn the time over to the audience for questions. And just raise your hand, and then when you have your question, please also just state your name and where you're from so we can get to know a little bit of the audience as well. Questions? And they're coming with the microphone, so.
My name's Greg Adams, and I'm an archivist at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. But beyond that role, I wanted to just kind of verbalize an expression of solidarity with the connection between the archives and applied use. In particular, I mean, everything that you're doing is, I mean, this is really impressive work, but in particular, I wanted to respond to Amma and Deborah, the idea of performing the archives. I think that this is something that's taking place with greater frequency, and I know in my own life, having the chance to do this very type of exploration at the University of Maryland with people in the fine and performing arts in the dance department, and there's a way of connecting the archival record where we were working to unpack concepts related to race, ethnicity, minstrelsy, slavery, but bringing the archival record into performance. I think that this is a really important thing. So my question is, now that we seem to be reaching a critical mass of activities, where does it go from here?
That's a great question. Is it Greg? Yes, great question. The frequency that Greg is talking about these innovative uses of performing the archive, it is increasing. There's a new collection, a new anthology that was just put out by Performance Studies International, where I think I don't know if they use the same title of Performing the Archive or Archives and Performance, but you have about 20 different theater practitioners, performance practitioners, performance theorists, talking about different angles in which they combine performance use and the archive, whether it's museum installations, whether it's this kind of recouping things that are lost and so forth. So this question of where do we go from here, I think it's a wide open journey, wide open field. I think I can see the start of a new discipline within academia. I really can, whether it's historical interpretation and performance or whatnot. We already see vestiges of this kind of work right now in major films. Every year, every Oscar year, you have contenders that deal with historical subjects in which archival research is drawn upon in some way. So whether it's 12 Years a Slave or The Butler that just came out, we know that the public loves historical stories. And we know that the public loves historical stories, most likely in popular entertainment. So that's another way I can see where we're going. And the more we can have, scholars that really see the value of the archive in those popular and artistic practices, I think the rigor, the intellectual rigor of such mass-produced products will increase as well. So I can see I can see where we go from here is in academia, there will be more understanding, more publications that translate what we do, that opens up scholarship. And then in arts and entertainment, I can see if we get our practitioners, our scholars in that land more so, we can see just better historically accurate things happening out there.
I would just add to that we often, or higher ed has often overlooked the undergraduate. And our undergraduates are coming to our institutions brighter, sharper, energetic pups, very well versed in the technology more so than some of us. And we should instead of trying to wrestle them into the old 20th century mode of you sit there in the class and I will tell you everything, that we engage them. And that's what the Boyer Commission actually recommended in the 90s. And some of our higher ed institutions have been better about embracing that than others. So.
Okay, I saw hands out here. Oh, one over here too. So let's go over here and then we'll come back here.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Rafael. I'm a visiting scholar from Fulbright and University of Maryland and from Brazil. And my question is for Amma and Deborah. Thank you so much for your presentation. I can see you, but I'm here. And the question is, the creative use of the archives could be a problem for the scientific use of them. I mean, if the creative use of archives present an interpretation that changed the content of the original use of the document that was not originally created to be performed. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, is it Raphael?
Yes.
I can't see you. Where are you?
Yeah.
Right back here. Truly back. Okay.
I'm here.
I have to make eye contact. Great question. So can you just rephrase that again so I can hear that last part? Are you saying?
Yeah, it's because the archives is not originally created to be performed. So if you use for a creative perform, you're changing the main goal of the archives. The person who did the archives, it was not for performance.
That's a wonderful question. And I think it also speaks to a philosophical concern of, well, is that accurate or not? You know, some people could say the things we have in the archive weren't even created to be archived, right? Yeah, so exactly. it's a similar issue. I think, so there's two things on that. I think that I think that's one of the brilliant things of using archival material in innovative ways. It's about also unlocking, and this goes back to Greg's question of the future, it's also unlocking how do we analyze such materials. Go back to those questions that I quoted earlier, of like how exactly do historians put emotion back into the inanimate text that they read? And I would submit that such a question suggests that archival material asks for such performance, that we have to remember the original context in which some of these things were created. So for example, Greg's point about minstrelsy or performances from the past. How do you study performances from the past when you're just reading descriptions? Actually, the real use of such archival material would be to enact it, if you really want to understand what was happening in the performance form. So I actually am on the other side of thinking that I think archival material themselves speak to wanting more than just our eyes going across the page. And that just unlocks different ways of analysis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Noel's going to add a comment here.
Hi, I just wanted to add to that as well. Thanks for the question. In terms of sound archives, quite often they are records of performances, and the recordings lack that performative aspect. So if normally when I talk about, say, the Sound of Africa example in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, if I have more time, I show videos where we're going around the townships and engaging with people. And as a musicologist, I go in there and play recordings, and I kind of expect a musical analysis, and it doesn't happen. The first thing that happens is people get up and show you the dance that goes with the songs. And in actual fact, people quite often said these recordings mean nothing without the dance as well. And the dance would show you certain things about your social hierarchy, your social status, how many cattle you own, or things like this. You know, the most common response to sound recordings in the townships were physical. And that was to get up, sometimes to cry, but basically to dance and exhibit upper body control and things like that. So I think the record is a record of performance, and then that performance gets lost, obviously, and it naturally gets reperformed. Thank you.
And I think we have an answer and a kind of suggestion from the American Folklife Center archive in that, first of all, our archive was, the first two heads of our archive both had book deals already when they came here. The idea being to produce books that people would then learn the songs and perform them. So the archive really was created to be performed at the outset, and then of course other values came into it after that. But another point is just that you know, our archive always has been performed, and a lot of Americans know some of the songs in our archive without knowing that they're here. So like Johnny Cash's first track on his first album is Rock Island Line, which he learned from Leadbelly, who was the field worker who collected it for our archive back in the 30s. So that's just one example, but one of the things that we do is that we actually travel not only to academic conferences, but to conferences where performers get together and meet. So we go to, for example, the Folk Alliance Conference, which is a meeting of folk musicians, and we make presentations on our archive there as opposed to just academic ones. So that's one way of kind of suggesting how we can get this out for performing the archives kind of applications.
Great, thank you. Other questions here in the front?
I'm Karen Jefferson from the Atlanta University Center Woodruff Library. And what this made me think about is that the history is really, this is about culture that's about socialization. So it's not about you just internalizing, this is my history. It's teaching you something, and when you learn something, a new generation, it's going somewhere else. So you have to, you know, it's going to change. If we just stayed in that same cultural space, with the same music, with the same, we're not going anywhere. So what we have to learn as archivists is, as much as I like the purity of this is what happened, this is the truth, this is the fact, if it doesn't go anywhere, then you haven't learned anything. And boy, the new generation learns a whole lot faster than we did.
And just to piggyback on that, so as the librarian and the archivist, it is my role to, if they are doing some revisionist history, that's the learning opportunity without lecturing them. We're working through this together, and we're talking about the U.S. The civil rights movement and the poets, and anything else about this woman who did her radio broadcast. So yes.
I'll just add to that briefly as well. This culture of socialization, one example of, when I went out to South Africa, I originally started to look at 3,000 songs. Ended up writing a thesis about 6, but really should have written it about 1, which is this song called Somagwaza, initiation song, which is actually in some Smithsonian recordings and things. And Hugh Tracy listed it as a praise song for an Mpondo chief after he slaughtered a cattle. That was what he was told in 1956. Nearly every ceremony sings the version of this song now, still. And the moment this song was introduced, the debates about what this song meant were incredible. You know, so it's like nobody agreed that that's what it meant. It may have meant that for an Mpondo group in 1956, but it doesn't mean that today. And the men were like, oh, no, the women, they shouldn't hear this. And the women were like, what are you talking about? We know what this song is, we sing it. You know, and then other people would say, oh, it can only happen in this situation, at this point of the ceremony. And the young artists are like, but we perform it on stage and tour it internationally. What are they talking about? You know, and so all these debates about what this song meant was fascinating, triggered by a recording made by somebody that is effectively an editor with a bias, you know, as any collector is. So once we unfreeze that and begin circulating it, the responses through this recording are, it changes. And 100 responses, 100 different versions of who Somagwaza was, what it meant, etc. So, yeah.
Other questions here in the back?
Yeah, Leslie Sewell. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've used the archives here a lot. But some of the people touched on the issue of copyright and permissions, which is a huge thing for people in my business. And it's gotten much more difficult over the last decade or so. Is there anything that, I mean, I realize you can't change the laws, but in terms of making it easier for people to disseminate this information, do you guys have any suggestions?
Well, one of the conversations that I had with a researcher at Florentine Films was their issue is they find these images online that maybe someone snatched from someplace and put up on their website, and they don't even know where it is. Mm-hmm. They don't even know who to talk to about it. So she was very thankful when she found our website because it is very clear for each digital object, who does it belong to? How can I contact them? And we make it very easy for those conversations to happen.
I just add from the music perspective, yeah, very difficult because obviously copyright is different in different countries. It was quite difficult to explain to people, I can play these recordings, but I can't give them to you. But what you can do is go to the International Library of African Music and express a request, and if it's a valid request, they'll probably give them to you. And if you can't afford to buy them because they've been published, they might give them to you. You know, so a lot of people hadn't thought through copy. There was some anger. There was quite often who benefited from these recordings. Someone else has made careers out of them. There was some anger in response to who controlled the copyright, which is now owned by Rhodes University. The archive is part of Rhodes University in South Africa. So it's kind of trying to explain what an archive is doing and what copyright may or may not mean for local communities. And there was an investigation of royalties that may be due, actually through the Global Sound Project at Smithsonian, royalties that might be due to performers, some of these colossal performers. A master's student wrote a thesis on it, and based on sales and tracking back to the musicians, they were all due, as a group performance, they were all due something like 50p, 40 cents, and it cost hundreds of dollars to find that out, thousands of dollars to find that out. Royalties were not the answer, you know, but raising awareness of musicians' rights and how they can protect those rights was one way through it as well. And we deal with that quite carefully through the Pit River, so we can put it on SoundCloud, but nobody can, unless you know how to get it, nobody is going to get access to that. And the Buyaka collection is explicitly, any benefit must go to the community. You know, so as you know, it costs a lot of money to curate a collection like that. But any income generated should go to the community.
Questions in front here? Oh, sorry. One in the back, and then we'll come back to the front. We have a microphone back there.
Hi, I'm Lucy Barber. I'm from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, but this has nothing to do with the project that we sponsored in any way. It's just, I mean, it seems like the interesting theme here is about, do you take the materials of the archives out into the community, ask them how they want them to be presented in some cases, like what Noel talked about, or do you bring different people into contact with them? And one other program that maybe some of you have heard of is the City of Portland Archives. It also sponsors a art fellowship where two artists people can apply to then be, work in the archives on artistic projects of their own design. And I think that kind of creativity of presenting what you find in the archives. I mean, I've seen other artists do it, but for the archives to sort of be actively soliciting that type of synergy, I think is another way of reaching out and exposing your collections to people that might not be thinking about it. And obviously it's not everybody can offer money to go along with it, but even just, reaching out to the artist community, because, I mean, I'm on the side of, I am a historian and was trained that way. I'm like Dana, I'm not an actual archivist. I just play one sometimes. But I do think that what students, people make of the archives that we hold is going to expose things that we don't know about, even if they may not be fact. It may just be a new creative interpretation. So,
thank you.
Hi. Oh, we're going to have a response here?
I just wanted to support whatever your idea that you were just saying by the example from the Provincial Archives of Alberta. It's a project in progress. It's happening right now. And what they did, they invited, I think, about 30 beginning musicians and songwriters to the archives. None of them ever used the collection, the archives, so it was their first visit to the archives. And they did kind of a workshop for them. They showed them how to use the archives, what treasures they had and stuff like that. So after that, each of them started using the archives, and it's a month-length project. Started using the archives, and they each wrote a song. So now they're going to meet, I think it's this weekend, for the big performance. and each piece will be based on the archives collection. And also during all this process, they invited a documentary filmmaker. So he was filming all this process as they were discovering for themselves the archives. So I think it's a very good example of what you were just saying.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that to let us know about that project.
Yeah, we had a similar experience at the Yorkshire Film Archive, working with a visual artist who chose material from World War II, and we did some blow-ups of very small 8mm frames, different small gauge frames, and had a whole intergenerational project with the children of the filmmakers who were children during World War II and young children now. But the challenge with this project was that amateur film is, proud of being what it is and being kind of outside of the mainstream, not being really an art form. The filmmakers have their cine clubs and are very keen on keeping it aesthetically a hobby. So curating that into a gallery setting was a bit complicated. But I think working with the filmmakers, the artist and us together, we managed to
very collaborative,
to have a satisfactory result that wouldn't make it precious or, I don't know, curatorialize it, I don't know how you can say.
Yeah.
But there are other cases I've seen where it does become a bit of a joke with people using archive footage from the 50s, I don't know, women, home domestic situations, and recontextualize it in a slightly inappropriate manner. So it is there needs to be, I think, the mediation maybe between the
collaboration
authors,
between all the different parties. Noel, did you
Just very briefly add a couple of observations to that based on the South African example. One of the first questions I asked people was if this was your archive, what would you do with it? And a lot of people said, well, this resource should be in the township. We need the resources here. It's a very under-resourced place. But some people did say, no, it's right, it's where it is, because it would get destroyed in the township. It's like, so it's complicated and the right way to do it. And Tera Tiota, who you saw was the guy playing a few recordings to his children, he's an uadi player. He plays a traditional bow, and he's also a very accomplished bass player that plays Beyonce covers, and he's very comfortable doing both. And he said, I'm an expert in this in my tradition. My father was a traditional healer who played these bow songs in ceremonies. But I don't have a piece of paper that says that I'm an expert in my. So you mentioned 4-year degrees as your main user or something in like a user survey. 4-year. He said I haven't got those things to say that I'm an expert in my tradition, and yeah, he is. It's the European academics that are allowed to speak about this music, and those are the voices, his voices that are so crucial. Like Tedder's are the ones that are missing from an interpretation of the archive, I think.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I think what we're hearing with all of this is that it is a balance between making sure whatever archival documents or audio or film, whatever you're using, that you have a balance with what's being presented or what's being interpreted. So it's not one-sided. You're getting everybody's perspective, and that's being blended into whether you're using it for a performance or for a presentation, but that you have a really good balance. Okay, so let's go back to your question.
Okay. I'm Jay Komiak. I'm also an accidental archivist, a term that I've just discovered here. Thank you for that. But I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist. I have oversight for the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum's anthropology collections and their 2 archives. One is the National Anthropological Archives. The other is the Human Studies Film Archives. And even at a place like the Smithsonian, we find that archives, depending upon where they're nested in an institutional system, cry out for resources and staffing. So, Noel, I was really struck by the fact that you've done an amazing project, and I was struck by the fact that the museum has taken it on to apparently have special evenings where they play the music in their galleries. I'm wondering how you pulled that off, number one. And then for, I think it's Maryna, my Ukrainian friend, because I've worked across both material collections and archives, I heard you point out that you kind of made a separation between these things. There are museums that have Ukrainian material culture, and they're perhaps best suited for that, but you're dealing with folklore in its varied forms. And I just wanted to make a suggestion, because we've been engaged in a number of programs in my museum where we're actually joining the resources of these two things. Now, in the particular institution where I'm in, they happen to be historically, many of these resources happen to be historically linked, but we increasingly serve a broader range of Native communities who come not only to see our manuscript collections, our language materials, but also the cultural artifacts, some of which are now, 125, 130, 40 years old, and they tack between these two things, and we learn a lot about this because, yes, to play a recording, to see a photograph is to be moved, to evoke memories, but to pick up an object is also to tell a different kind of story, and those stories integrate together. So I just throw that out, but Noel, if I could get your read on how did you convince your museum to take your archival materials so seriously?
Yeah, good question. It's taken quite a few years. How did we pull it off? Creative use of funding streams, first of all, but basically there's been a drive recently, and it's something I've been pushing to show that sound collections are just as much a part of the collections as objects. So I know some people I've met already have been to the Pitt Rivers beautiful ethnographic museum, object driven. And what's been in the background has been film, photography and sound. So we wrote a funding application that made the argument that sound has become the complete orphan collection, and yet it's so central to the collecting process and things and what it tells us. And we also have a big 5-year public engagement program whereby we're designing outreach and new audiences. And then I made the argument that sound is the best thing we could possibly use for something like this. So turn the lights off, invite people in with torches, bathe them in sound, designed with professional sound engineers. So the next one on November the 22nd, there'll be about, it makes a few people nervous in the galleries, but about 16 speakers, interactive iPads, professionally designed and engineered, and it's going to become an installation that tours as well, when we work more closely in due course with the community as well. I just think that the time seems right from our perspective, that it's taken a while to get photography back in amongst the collections, and the time seems right now that sound and music should be part of the collections again. So if John very kindly had it queued up. I had a video to show, but I didn't have time of what it looks like in these galleries. You can see it online, and we'll stream it on November the 22nd. It's nearly 4,000 people came in across a previous event for this, and the audience feedback is so strong how music and sound changes their perception of both the museum and their perception of a culture as well. They're like, this music is amazing. Like, well, we know that, So I think that's one short answer of how we began. I also work as an events promoter as well, so I can pull in some of those skills and things. But I think it's really important to make it a physical experience again, rather than just MP3s on a set of headphones, And it seems true to the experience of museum going, gallery going, if you like. So that's one answer. But yeah.
Thanks for that.
And I want to speak to our partners and the research we've done there with them about the political aspects. This ties into this about raising your profile and gathering attention for your collections. And talking to our 250 partners, they found a lot of political value in providing online access to part of their collections. We heard from folks saying things like, the people at our city hall know who we are now. And stories about their local communities, their local newspapers, doing stories about their archives because they now are more aware of them. So they do see a big benefit from that, just providing stuff online.
Well, unfortunately, we are up on our time, so I just want to thank those who asked.
Can I just shortly
no, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your comment. I just wanted to shortly mention that we do strive to use, when a researcher comes to the archives, we try to provide him with different media on his research topics. So would it be manuscripts, audio, video, artifacts, so all the scope. But the collection that we have, the artifacts collection that we have, is not a museum quality collection. It's more educational collection, so we can take it to the class when we teach folklore class and let the students touch it as much as they want, even try it if they want. But yes, and with the different museums that exist in Edmonton, the problem is that they are mostly community museums. They lack resources. They don't have professional stuff. They are run by volunteers mostly. So it's, well, lots of preservation issues and stuff like that. But thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I want to, again, thank so much our panel. They are doing amazing work and shared amazing projects that they're doing. So let's give them another round of applause. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.